Open the pod bay doors.
Greetings and welcome to another exciting episode of the Cinematic Traveler Podcast. I am your intrepid movie-exploring host, Chris, and on this episode, we've done it. We finally have done it. We've reached the end of our 6-movie series review here of Star Trek films, and we are wrapping it up with Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, directed by Nicholas Meyer. And as excited as I am to talk to you about this movie, I'm not going to lie, I'm a little excited to be wrapping up this series. It has been entertaining. I hope that you are enjoying it. And if you are, if you could just do me a favor, whatever you're listening to this show on, somewhere on that screen, there is a follow button. If you could just hit that follow button, I would appreciate it. It does help me and the show, but it also helps you as you won't miss any future episodes, as well as you'll be able to go back and listen to previous episodes and hear my amazing reviews in my sexy, sexy voice. Also, if you could share the show with your friends, families, evil Klingons in their cloaked birds of prey, I don't care. As long as someone is listening, you can also share the show on social media, and you can find me on social media. I am on Instagram at Cinematic Traveler Pod. I'm on X/Twitter at CMT Pod, and I'm on Blue Sky. That one is at Cinematic Traveler something. And I have an email address, thecinematictravelerpod@gmail.com. So you have plenty of ways to get in touch with me and follow the show. So there, I got through all of that podcaster mumbo jumbo quick, fast, and in a hurry so we could dive into this episode. I hope you're doing well out there, my beloved listener. I know you're a little sad that we're wrapping up this Star Trek series. So am I. But let's not get too upset. We get to actually talk about a very fun movie. At least we're ending on a semi-high note here. It could be a lot worse. We could have ended with Star Trek V, and then we would all be really, really miserable after that. So if you are ready to get into this review, you know you have to meet me in the transporter room. Okay, is everybody ready? Great. Mr. Scott, energize. All right, and as I mentioned in the opening, Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, is directed once again by Nicholas Meyer, who is most famous in the Star Trek series for directing Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. And they brought him back to wrap up the series with a movie that was influenced by the happenings of the end of the Cold War, as well as the disaster in Chernobyl. Oh, wait, everybody calm down. Here comes Captain Kirk. I think he has something to say.
Do you mind telling me what this is all about, mister?
Yes, sir. For the last time, you will be giving me that order, because this is my last plot synopsis for a Star Trek film. So, with The Undiscovered Country, and for the last time, we do travel back to the 23rd century, where we join Captain Sulu on the USS Excelsior? What? As they are out doing some experiments on space gases or some weird Star Trek thing, and the starship is suddenly rocked by a giant energy wave from Klingon territory. It seems Praxis 1, the Klingon homeworld's power supply planet or whatever, has exploded, causing the Klingon homeworld to be on a trajectory of total destruction within the next 50 years. Now, back at Starfleet Command, we join a large meeting where Spock has volunteered Captain Kirk and the crew of the USS Enterprise to be representatives of peace, to meet the Klingon Chancellor Gorgon, played by David Warner, and escort him to a very significant peace conference that could end this Cold War between these two factions. There is only one problem. Kirk, as we all know, has no love loss for the Klingons, especially since he blames them for the death of his son David. Now, after an awkward dinner with Gorgon and his crew, it does appear that the USS Enterprise fires on Gorgon's ship and 2 crew members beam over and assassinate him. Well, Kirk and McCoy beam over to try to save him, and they fail, and then they are arrested by Gorgon's, I guess, second in command, General Chang, played by the always wonderful Christopher Plummer. They are eventually sent to the prison planet of Rurapente, which is this snow-covered, brutally cold planet where life is miserable, much like the northeastern part of the United States. Ha! Well, on this planet, naturally, Kirk and McCoy are trying to escape, and they do get the help of a suspicious prisoner. And back on the Enterprise, Spock and crew are trying to solve the mystery of who caused the destruction of Gorgon's ship, as well as who transported over there to assassinate him. And again, this investigation is led by Mr. Spock and Chekhov, but he also gets help from Lieutenant Valeris, played by the lovely Kim Cattrall, who we eventually find out is a traitor to the cause, because there are many amongst Starfleet and the Klingon Empire who do not want there to be peace. So it is up to our heroic crew to save the day as Spock flies over to the planet of Rurapente and saves Kirk and McCoy. They make it to the peace conference just in time to save the Federation president, played by Kurtwood Smith, and restore the faith in the peace process that was started by Chancellor Gorgon, thus saving the day and saving the universe. And then we watch the Enterprise fly off into sort of a sunset as Captain Kirk says, "Second star to the right," and straight on until morning. And our crew rides off into the sunset with a perfect ending to the series, and what we all thought was the last time we would see the crew of the Enterprise again. And after seeing the Star Trek The Next Generations movie, we wish it was the last time we saw the original crew. All right, we'll get into that later. But that basically covers the plot of Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. So moving into my review, if this is the first time you've listened or you haven't listened in a while, I do break my reviews down into 3 segments: the good, the bad, and the nitpicky. The good are the positives of the movie, the bad, obviously, the negatives of the movie, and the nitpicky, these are things that are neither good nor bad, just sometimes Hollywoodisms or sometimes silly things my weird little brain picks up on that make me laugh. And as I'm trying to do with this podcast, I'd like to make you laugh, because if there's 2 things on this planet I love to do, one of them is to quote Shakespeare while drinking Romulan ale, and the other is to make you laugh. So let's go ahead and dive into our review with the good. So I guess we'll start our final review for these Star Trek movies with the cast and the positives they bring to this film. I think our original crew all do a fine job representing their characters one last time. It is nice to see that Sulu actually got off the ship. I'm not sure how much that had to do with his relationship with William Shatner. I don't know, but he was promoted to captain, and he's on the USS Excelsior, and he actually comes in at the end and gets to participate in the space battle between General Chang's Bird of Prey and the Enterprise. So he doesn't just get his opening segment, he actually does get to participate in the plot of the movie. Other members of the cast, including Scotty, James Doohan, and Uhura, Nichelle Nichols, they all have their moments. A lot of those revolve around that infamous dinner scene in which they are all a little too intoxicated, and some of the underlying racism, we might say, in the Federation towards the Klingons, and for the Klingons back to the Federation, kind of bubbles over in that dinner. Let's just say they don't represent the best of humankind as they go out there. But I think they have some great moments throughout the movie. There's also this fun little bit where they have to speak Klingon to the Klingons without using the universal translator, or else they'll get found out that they're trying to save Kirk and McCoy. So that's a fun little bit that you get to see Uhura and Scotty trying to figure out what to say, even though And I do agree with this. This is a little bit of behind the scenes trivia. As I mentioned in the other ones, if you haven't listened by now, I'm not really doing a retrospective of this movie, but I will drop a few trivia nuggets as we go along. But Nichelle Nichols wasn't a fan of that scene because she felt that Uhura would know how to speak Klingon after all those years. And I kind of do agree with that. I mean, it's a funny little scene, but yeah, you watch Uhura, you're like, damn, she's been doing this a long time. She would know how to speak that. But at any rate, they do a great job. Chekhov, he gets to shine a little bit, I think is the right way of saying it. He does get a lot to do, but he sort of plays the Watson to Mr. Spock's Sherlock Holmes as they're trying to solve the mystery. And by that, I mean he gets to ask a lot of dumb questions for the dumb audience so that Mr. Spock can clarify what's going on. He does that well. Chekhov plays dumb very, very well. I don't know how much that speaks for the actor. And of course, Bones is still great as Bones. He gets to have his moments, especially when they are on the prison planet. And Kirk just gets into his Captain Kirk stuff with fights, and the moment where I think is it Martia? I think that's how she says her name, played by Iman. She's the shape-shifting prisoner that helps Kirk and McCoy escape. And there's that point where she kisses Captain Kirk, and I love it because Bones just looks at him and is like, what is it with you? But I just love that little bit because, it's kind of, I don't want to say being a parody of Star Trek, but it does kind of poke a little fun at Captain Kirk always making out with everybody back in the series. So that was a good bit. Mr. Spock, of course, he's excellent in this movie. This is a bit of a different Mr. Spock. We get the logical side, especially when he's playing up the sort of Sherlock Holmes bit in the film, which I should point out, that's a Nicholas Meyer thing, because as I mentioned in Star Trek II, he is a pretty prolific writer and director, and he wrote a few Sherlock Holmes stories, including the 7% Solution. So he's a big fan of Sherlock Holmes, and that incorporates itself into this movie. They even have a quote from Sherlock Holmes where, in fact, Spock uses a line, an ancestor of mine maintained that if you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth, which is kind of a variation of a famous Sherlock Holmes line. But at any rate, Mr. Spock, he has that side of him, but he also has a bit of a ruthless side, because as he finds out that Valeris is one of the people involved in the conspiracy to kill Chancellor Gorkon, he gets very angry. It's a controlled anger, except when he does that mind meld and he forces his mind meld on her. But he's very upset at her because he had wanted her to take his place as he was set to retire. He wanted her to be the next Vulcan aboard the Enterprise. And he really had invested a lot in her career and put a lot of faith and belief in her, only to find out that she was this villain. So you really do see sort of I hate to say ruthless. It's not like he tears the ship apart or something, but you do get to see a little bit of a different side to Spock, a little angrier and more vengeful than you're used to. So that was really cool to see. And then you have, of course, William Shatner as Captain Kirk. I mean, come on. If you've been listening so far, you know how I feel about the Shatner. And of course, he does a great job as Captain Kirk. This one, we finally get a little bit of a maybe resolution to the death of his son, David. There's actually some points in the movies, especially very early on, where he is upset about this and having to deal with the Klingons because of what has happened. And by the end, he tells Gorkon's daughter, who is now the Chancellor, that, she has restored David's faith and peace and all that stuff. So you actually do get a conclusion to that thing that they set up way back in Star Trek II that I had been waiting for several movies. Well, they finally do wrap that up. But he gets his Kirk's moments where he gets to get in a fight in the prison. It's not an over-the-top elaborate fight. He kind of fights for a man of his age. He actually did the fight scene in that, so he gets thrown through a fire and stuff. It kicks the guy in the knees, and only to find out that those weren't his knees. And then he has the wonderful fight where the shapeshifter basically shapeshifts into Captain Kirk. So that is just a throwback to the series. I don't know how, but there has to be, I think, at least 2 episodes where Kirk basically fights himself. So that was kind of a fun callback. And there were some lines in there where I think Kirk says, "I can't believe I kissed you." And she answers back as Kirk, "It must have been the highlight of your life," or something like that. And Nicholas Meyer, he was a bit concerned. He thought Shatner wouldn't go along with those lines, but it turned out Shatner had a good time joking around about basically his Captain Kirk persona. So Again, that was fun. Plus, you get him at the end where they're having the space fight with General Chang in the Bird of Prey. You get that great moment where they finally get the proton torpedo with the sensor to pick up, the gaseous thing, so it can basically be a heat-seeking missile. And they're ready. They get it ready, and Kirk just leans into the camera and goes, "Fire!" And it's just a great moment, great Captain Kirk moment where you're like, hell yeah, that's your ass, Chang. You don't fuck with the Enterprise. No, sir, you don't fuck with the Enterprise. So top to bottom, the cast, they do go out on a high note here, and I'm really am glad they made this movie. As I mentioned in Star Trek V, there was some doubt that they were going to make this movie, but I'm glad they did, because it did wrap it up and give them all a high note to end on. Speaking of high notes, my favorite performance in the whole movie, and I think next to Khan, this guy is probably the best Star Trek villain ever. That would be General Chang. Christopher Plummer is just having a blast in this role. He's quoting Shakespeare through the whole damn thing, and he's such a great villain, and he's just reveling in being a bad guy who is trying to play nice for his boss, but once that assassination happens, all gloves are off. So he's in the courtroom for some reason. I guess General Chang is a lawyer, so he's prosecuting Kirk and McCoy, and he's having a good time sort of catching them in their own words and setting them up. And then, like I said, when they're having this space fight, and he's quoting all of those Shakespeare lines, just having a blast. "Once more, unto the breach, dear friends. Cry havoc, and let's slip the dogs of war." I love it. I love Chang. It was so fun. I haven't watched this movie in such a long time, and I watched it again. I was just having a blast with Christopher Plummer. He's worth watching the movie to me. He is so good as the villain. Kim Cattrall, I think she does a fine job as Valara. She plays that Vulcan very well. Plus, she's easy on the eyes. Another behind the scene. This one, I don't know if it's true or not. When I read it, there are conflicting reports. This is a little saucy for the show, but apparently, maybe, possibly, maybe it didn't happen, maybe it did, but Kim Cattrall was in her Vulcan ears and stuff, and she snuck onto the bridge set of the Enterprise naked and had some pictures made, and then Leonard Nimoy found out and had everything destroyed. God, what a party poopa, the party poopa. But from what I've read, that has been denied. But Kim Cattrall's response to that was not a really overwhelming negative. How should I put it that way? Oh, if those exist, please put those out there. But at any rate, I think she does a good job as the Vulcan, and she's the turncoat. And you can see that she's really hurt by upsetting Mr. Spock, as well as getting the mind probe by him. Say what you will about that. Let's see, who else? David Warner, he's always great. He does a good job here as Chancellor Gorkon. It's nice to see him playing a good guy every now and then. He usually, for most of his career, it seemed like he was always playing the villain, even the ultimate villain in Time Bandits. But here he gets to play the good guy for a moment. And Kurtwood Smith, I'm going to bring him up for a reason, but he plays the president of the Federation. It's not a big part, not really especially an important part, but it will lead into something later on. See, I'm setting things up. I'm trying to keep you listening to the whole episode. What is he going to say about Kurtwood Smith? You'll have to find out. Pay attention to my crew. My next positive for the movie is, yes, you have Nicholas Meyer back. Again, directed the great Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. I don't think it works quite as well as that movie, and we'll get to some of the negatives here soon. But again, he knows this universe. He knows these characters after that movie. He knows what he wants for this movie to be this allegory for the end of the Cold War between the U.S. and Russia. At least that's what we thought many moons ago, as well as incorporating the Chernobyl disaster as sort of the catalyst for what this movie was. It has a similar disaster, and that's what starts the peace process. So he definitely has a vision for this movie that he follows along. He brings in that naval battle thing that he brought into Star Trek II. So you get that. You actually get more of what the crew does on the ship, which was kind of fun. You get to see them, their quarters and the kitchen that they're working in and all this stuff. So you get to see more of the, I guess you would call it, military procedure for the ship. And it pulls you into that naval type situation that he went for in Star Trek II. And of course, everything looks great. The space battle, they brought ILM back, so you get very good special effects. In fact, the destruction of the bird of prey, I think that was used in 2 more Star Trek movies or the Star Trek series. They used it a couple more times. It was such a great shot. So all of that is competently made, and the movie flows for the most part pretty well. It does have a little more humor to it than I would say Star Trek 2, or I shouldn't say more humor, more, God, I guess silly humor, as it were. You get the whole thing where they're trying to find the gravity boots, and if you've seen this movie, they track them down to this one crew member, and they call him back to the quarters. Everybody's standing there, and Chekhov, again, like I said, he plays the dumb character a lot in this movie, but he turns to him with the boots, and he's like, "Do you know the Russian proverb of Cinderella, well, if the shoe fits?" And then he throws the boots down, and everybody looks, and he's got weird looking feet, so he can't wear the boots. So you get some humor like that throughout the movie, but the humor isn't quite as goofy as it was in Star Trek V. It does play a little more naturally here and does add a little lightness to the film, which is nice. You wanted this one to kind of mix that tone of seriousness with what's happening, as well as bring in some of that comedy that we've gotten used to since Star Trek IV. And ultimately, as far as his direction and making this film, I think this is a great send-off for this cast. I've already mentioned it before, but it was nice to walk out of the theater and see your heroes one last time being heroes and saving. In fact, Kirk says as he gets on the bridge at the end, "Once again, we've saved civilization as we know it." So, that's a great way to end the series. I really do wish these characters would not have returned in another series, but at any rate, it was a nice way to close out this 6-film series. And he does all of this in an hour and 49 minutes. I mean, come on. You have all of this story and all of these action set pieces and these characters going off in different directions, and yet it all wraps up in less than 2 hours. Beautiful. You will always get a positive for that. So let's go ahead and move into the bad. And I didn't find a whole lot with this movie to dislike. I think for the most part, this is a very solid movie, enjoyable all the way through. And as much as I enjoyed the performances of the cast, the main cast especially, you can kind of get a sense that they were maybe ready for this to be over with. I wouldn't put this up with their best performances in the series. Again, they do a very good job because they're just playing the same characters they've been doing for a long time, especially in the 6th movie of this series. So there are moments in the movie where I don't want to say that they look tired, but you just feel like they're like, okay, here it is. I'm being this character. I'm being Mr. Spock, or I'm being Chekhov. Even Kirk had a few moments where it felt like he was just like, okay, here I am. Let's just move on with it. Not terrible, and I really hate to put it in the negatives because I think the performances are all good. But I could notice in this watching that you kind of see a sense of, oh, I'm so glad this is over. And really my only other negative to this film, and I have thought this the last few times I've seen this movie, the whole prison subplot with Kirk and McCoy, while it's fun and you get some great bits in there and it's got some exciting moments and you get some glorious Captain Kirk being Captain Kirk moments and Bones being Bones and all that, it just feels like it's tacked on, or it's there just for them to have something to do while they're trying to solve the mystery on the Enterprise, because really they don't learn anything new while they're there. It doesn't add to the plot of the movie. We already know there's this conspiracy going on. We already know there's, people on both sides. They got to figure out who it is. So ultimately that whole subplot really doesn't add anything to the movie other than just having the fun of it. So again, it's a mild negative criticism of the film because, again, I enjoyed that segment, but by the time it gets over, you're just like, okay, well, they're really at the same point they were when they got arrested. We didn't learn anything more. We learned more on the Enterprise than we did on the prison planet. And I guess since we're in the negative, I did read some of the behind-the-scenes stuff in the trivia, and this seemed to be maybe, I don't want to say a controversial filmmaking process, but there seemed to be a little bit of behind the scenes disagreements between Nicholas Meyer and Gene Roddenberry. In fact, Nicholas Meyer said that they had a meeting with Gene Roddenberry, who was ill at the time, and they had a big argument about what direction they should take the movie. And Gene Roddenberry didn't agree with that, and they had some words at the end. And then Roddenberry, he saw the movie and died 2 days later. So I don't want to blame Nicholas Meyer, but he may or may not have killed Gene Roddenberry. No, but Nicholas Meyer, he said that he always regretted that they had harsh words, and that was the last moment they had together. Also, there was some stuff with the dialogue that I completely understand, and it seems really tone deaf, even in, what was this, 1990, 1991, for the makers of this movie. But like I mentioned, there's sort of this theme of racism underneath what's going on here, because our beloved crew of the Enterprise, they say some ugly things about these Klingons. And I know they had a moment, and it's still in the movie, where right before the dinner, Kirk talks to Gorgon on the bridge of the ship, and he's like, I invite you over for dinner. And after it's over, Chekhov says, guess who's coming to dinner? Which, if you know, is a reference to a movie that is about racism, basically. And they were originally going to have Nichelle Nichols say that line, but she refused, and rightfully so. And good for her to stand up and say she should never, really, that line should have been in there. I get it's an easy laugh, but she definitely should not have been saying that line. Like I said, good for her for standing up. Also, another actor, Brock Peters, he plays Admiral Cartwright in this movie. And very early on in the film, when they're having the big meeting at the beginning to kind of send the Enterprise off, he does have some very hateful comments about the Klingons. And again, this is an African-American, a black actor saying some really ugly, and behind the scenes stuff said that he really struggled with that because he did not want to say those type of things, because basically what he's been through in his life. So yeah, it was kind of weird. It doesn't come across as a negative. There wasn't like a lot of stuff where it was like, oh, they all hated each other. But there was some of the stuff in the behind the scenes information that I read. It kind of had a feeling of, like I said, maybe tone deaf for what the situation was. Maybe the writers and Nicholas Meyer just saw it as these Klingon aliens, but they didn't really understand why certain actors would not want to say certain lines. So I don't know. Like I said, I don't want to go into a retrospective here, but I thought that was kind of interesting. And like I said, I'm proud of Nichelle Nichols for standing up. Good for her. Good for her. So that wraps up the bad or the negative for Star Trek VI. So let's move into the nitpicky. And again, these are things that are neither good nor bad, just silly things my weird little brain picks up on. I will start off with, as I mentioned, Chekhov, he just seems so dumb throughout this movie. But there's a point in the movie where the assassins, they're beaming back to the Enterprise and some Klingon blood gets on them. And apparently it got onto the transporter pad in the Enterprise, and they show the blood on the ground. And Chekhov just reaches out there, touches the blood with his finger, and is like, this must be Klingon blood. And I'm thinking, my God, dude, how many missions have you been on in space where just the slightest little thing could destroy the whole crew and turn them into like crystals and drain all the salt out of them, or, send them on some lunatic rampage and kill everybody on the ship? And you're just touching some weird colored liquid that you see. Come on, let's have a little protocol here, Chekhov, you damn Rusky. Let's see, my next nitpick, and I set this up. I set this up earlier, and I'm paying it off now. You've been waiting on pins and needles to get this payoff. As I mentioned, Kurtwood Smith, he plays the president of the Federation. And for most of us who know him, you either know him from two things, that 70s show, or for us 80s kids, you know him as Clarence Boddicker from RoboCop. Such a mean bastard. Such a mean bastard. Just a great villain. Oh, what a wonderful villain. Anyway, we're not talking about RoboCop. But I forgot that he was in this, and when I saw him, I was like, oh my God, I would give this movie a 10 out of 10. I would make this my favorite movie of all time if he would have walked into one of those meetings that he has and went, bitches, leave. I would have stood up in the theater and applauded this film for having him do that. I know. You see, that's how my brain works. It's all movies up there. There's nothing valuable that's stuck in my head. It's all just movie quotes and goofy movie scenes and shit like that. It's why I stay single. Who could live with me, right? Oh, my God. Speaking of living with things, my last nitpick, and I wanted to use this on every episode of these Star Trek movies that we've done, but I figured I would save it for the last one. I cannot imagine what the mental health situation for Starfleet is. And how many cases of PTSD there must be in Starfleet. Could you imagine? Can you imagine being on a starship or on the Enterprise, and you're just flying around every mission you go on? It's just crazy shit happening. You got Klingons trying to blow you up. You got Khan coming back from 20 years. He wants to kill you. You got aliens. You're traveling in the past to find whales. My God, how do you process that? How do you unload all of that at the end? You get off the ship. You can't walk over to your spouse or your family member and be like, holy shit, you cannot believe what I just went through. So I imagine the mental health professionals at Starfleet are top notch and are on call 24 hours, 7 days a week, because the stories they must hear from these poor crew members getting on that ship. I'd be like, please, God, don't send me back. Don't send me back. Put me on the bathroom cleaning detail here on Earth. I don't care. Just don't send me back. But anyway, that wraps up my nitpicking section. To wrap up my overall review of Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, this is an enjoyable film. I love watching it. It's a lot of fun. It's got the whole mystery side to it. It's got the great space battle, and it has the wonderful stuff on the prison planet. Even though it doesn't have much to do with the movie, it's still fun to watch. All the characters are doing a fine job. As I mentioned, they're ready to be over with. But you bless this movie. It has Christopher Plummer in it, and he is just chewing on that scenery. Oh, having a great time with all of his Shakespeare quotes as they're battling out, and the way he does his little hand gesture just to have him fire. Oh, it's so cool how he does that. Oh my God. Tickle us, do we not laugh? Prick us, do we not bleed? Wrong us, shall we not revenge? Christopher Plummer. Thank you for being in that movie, Christopher Plummer. So yeah, it's a fun ride. Again, like I mentioned, an excellent send-off. And when you left the theater, you were happy to see these heroes that you thought were pretty much retired at this point, that they were going off saving the galaxy again one last time. So yeah, overall, I think this is an enjoyable watch, and I would recommend it to really even a non-Star Trek fan. I think you could enjoy this movie because it does strike a good balance between the seriousness of the plot, some humor elements, and the action. So it kind of, again, it wraps up everything with a nice, neat little bow. So as promised from the very first episode in this series, I am going to rank all 6 films. I have 2 ranking systems, as a matter of fact. I'm going to give you my personal ranking of worst to best Star Trek movies. I'm sure you can guess the best one. And I'm also going to give you a ranking of Star Trek movies from worst to best that you should watch if you're not a big Star Trek fan or a non-Star Trek fan. But listening to this series has gotten you super excited and you want to dive into that amazing world. Let's start off with my ranking of all 6 of these films. Let's start at the bottom. I am going to say, and this was probably one of the hardest decisions. This and number 2 in the list. Those were the hardest 2 to come up with, because I think Star Trek the Motion Picture is probably considered better than Star Trek The Final Frontier. But when I did my rankings, I thought, okay, which one would I want to watch again if someone said, you got to watch one of these 2 right now? And I would choose Star Trek V before that. So my worst in the franchise is Star Trek the Motion Picture. Again, I don't think it's a terrible movie. It just drags on way too long, and it's kind of boring, and the cast really doesn't have that chemistry that you wanted. At least Star Trek V, they have some chemistry and some laughs, even though it's goofy, and it doesn't take 2.5 hours. So Star Trek the Motion Picture would be 6th on the list, so Star Trek V would be 5th on the list. Like I said, if I had to watch one of those 2 again, I would choose Star Trek V, because it's only an hour and a half long, and it moves at a pretty good pace. So at least it has that going for it. And there is, like I said, some chemistry. Now we get into the tough decisions here. For my number 4 on the list, I went with this film, Star Trek VI. I know, shocking. I can hear the gasps. How dare you? While I do enjoy this movie, I just got done telling you all the positives of it. I think it's an excellent way for the franchise to end. I don't think it's quite as tight a filmmaking process as the other films on this list. Again, you get that stuff with the prison that kind of veers off into something where I just go, why are we here? This isn't that important. And you get a few moments here and there where it feels like the movie's like, okay, you're an idiot, so I have to explain things to you. And again, I don't think this is a bad movie. Obviously, you just heard my review, but I just don't think it equals the ones above it. So that's why I got that at number 4. At number 3, weird that I've done this twice now. This is Star Trek 3 at number 3. I think between Star Trek 3 and Star Trek 6, I like 3 better because it feels better paced. You're really stuck on target in that movie. You don't really deviate off of, we got to get the Genesis planet and get Spock and save Savick and try to save David and fight the Klingon. So it moves along at a brisk pace. I think you start to see the seeds of the crew getting more to do outside of the first 2 movies. Now they have little things where Scotty gets to do stuff, and Uhura, Chekhov, and Sulu and stuff. So you get to see more of those characters. And again, like I said, I just feel like that movie flows so much better than Star Trek 6. I never at any point in that movie I'm like, why are we doing this scene? It all seems like it's just pushing forward to get to the end of the movie. My number 2 on my list of the best Star Trek films in this series, this one goes to the one with the whales, Star Trek IV. And I kind of wouldn't have thought that earlier, but after watching it again, I have such a good time with that movie. It's so funny. And I think the cast is having such a great time doing something different. And maybe that's what plays into one of the negatives I had in this movie, where they seem like they're ready to be over. That one feels like they're just reinvigorated because they're having the comedy moments. They're outside of the sort of space battle elements and all that stuff. So it's just such a fun watch, and it moves along. And Leonard Nimoy does such a great job directing it as a comedy that, it's just a fun watch. So that's why it's number 2. And naturally, the number 1 Star Trek film in this series is Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Do I need to go on and go listen to that review again to hear how much I love that movie? But that's almost a perfect movie. There's nothing really wrong with that film. There's no fat on the bone. It moves at a breakneck pace. It restores the chemistry of the crew, and it also gives you a great villain, Khan. He's the best villain in the series. No offense, General Chang. I love you, but Khan, he's just chewing that scenery, and him and Kirk going back and forth, and just, all the damage he does, and the space battle at the end, and then Spock dying and all the emotion with that. So, yeah, that movie is great start to finish, and that's why it's my number 1. So moving into my ranking of the movies you should watch if you're either new to Star Trek or not a Star Trek fan, but you'd like to watch these movies after listening to these amazing reviews. Let's start at the bottom again. I'm going to put Star Trek the Motion Picture at the bottom of that list as well. I think if I had never watched Star Trek and I watched that first, I would never want to watch Star Trek again. It's just too, I hate to say boring, because if you get into the story, it's fun, but it drags too much. How about that? It just kind of plods along at points where you're like, okay, let's get back to the movie already. You can guess what number 5 on the list is. That's Star Trek V. Although I will say that is, I think if you were never watched a Star Trek movie, you probably would enjoy it because of the goofy comedy. You would laugh at Star Trek more than anything. But it's kind of dumb. Let's be honest. So let's see. My number 4 on the list would be Star Trek 3. I think that one is a little difficult if you haven't been watching the series. If you came into that movie, you might be a bit confused. It does explain what's going on in the film, but that works better after watching Star Trek 2. So I think that's where it would be detrimental to that film, is you would have to sort of get caught up with what's going on in order to enjoy the film. Whereas if you watch Star Trek 2 and then Star Trek 3, it would make more sense and flow a lot better for you, which moves into my number 3 on this list. That would be Star Trek 2. As much as I love it, as I think is the best one, and I could probably argue with myself that if someone had never watched Star Trek and watched that movie, they would enjoy it because it is so well made, and it's just got the action and the emotion and everything you need in it. I do think if someone was new to Star Trek, the other movies on the list would help them maybe fall in love with the characters a little more, so it would be more impactful, which is why my number 2 on this list is Star Trek VI. I think this movie, and I know it's weird, right? But I'm coming at this from someone who's never watched Star Trek, and this is a Star Trek adventure that you don't need a whole lot of information about what's going on in the past in Star Trek. You don't really need to know, like with Star Trek 2, Khan, even though, you can kind of figure out what his motives are. It helps to know where it all started. Where this, you just know that the Klingons are the bad guys. And the parallels between the US and the USSR at this time with the Cold War and everything, you could kind of pick up on everything. And it does blend the action and the comedy and some of the silliness of Star Trek together. But it has, like I said, we just did this review. I don't want to do it again, but it has enough entertaining value that I think if I was to tell someone, hey, the second film you should watch in this series is Star Trek VI, because you really enjoy it. And you don't have to really be deep in the lore of Star Trek to enjoy the film, which naturally leads to the number one movie on this list for someone who has never watched Star Trek or is new to it, and would be the easiest film in the series to watch. And that, of course, is Star Trek IV, the one with the whales. Because, it is a straight-up comedy. You get the fish out of water stuff. I mentioned in my review, it's not really a parody, but it does have fun with sort of the Star Trek stuff that even if you're not a Star Trek fan. And it plays with those kind of tropes from those movies before it and the series before it. And ultimately, it's just a funny damn movie. Like I said earlier, I watched it again after so many years, and I laughed a lot throughout that film. So I think if that would really ease someone into it, where you'll be like, okay, I do like these characters, and I do like Star Trek. And then you could get more into these Star Trek-y movies in the series, to where you kind of need to know a little more about what's happening. So that is my list if you want to give it to people who have never watched the show or the movies. Or, as I mentioned, if you're listening to these for the first time and I have persuaded you to watch those movies, then I really have done my job, because all 6 movies are definitely worth a watch and are, I guess, the height of Star Trek cinema. I don't think, and I know I've said it from time to time on this show, I don't like the Next Generation movies. I like the show, especially the middle seasons, but the movies were just terrible. I'm sorry. I will argue about every one of them. Even First Contact, I think, is a bad movie. Whereas with the original crew, when they kind of hit the stride with Star Trek 2, they all became really good movies. And after that, the Star Trek in 2009 was fun. I will agree that it wasn't a very good representation of Star Trek, but it was still a fun reintroducing into that universe with new, younger versions of these characters. I think they dropped the ball with Star Trek Into Darkness when they brought Khan into it, because they really hadn't earned it at that point. They should have gone in. They had any direction they could have gone into, and they chose that. That was a bad move. Star Trek Beyond is all right. I think that's a fun little watch. But again, it's just kind of mediocre at best. So really, these are the height of Star Trek films. So I hopefully either you'll rewatch some of them, or, maybe you'll start watching these movies and maybe go watch the original series, and that'll lead you into more Star Trek shows like The Next Generation and Voyager and Deep Space Nine. And then you'll watch the Next Generation cast in their big screen movies, and you'll argue with me, and you'll lose, because those movies are all bad. Let's see, do I want to talk about new Star Trek stuff? There's so many people on YouTube that just bitch about it. Oh my God, people are so weird. I think the funniest thing with these new Star Trek iterations of Star Trek Discovery and Picard and Strange New Worlds is when people are like, oh, it's woke, it's diverse. And I just go, have you never watched Star Trek? That was sort of the whole point of the original series, was they were inclusive with everybody. That's why you had Nichelle Nichols on the bridge, and it was such an important moment in TV history. At any rate, I don't know. I will say I was not a big fan of Discovery. I kind of gave up on that one midway through the first season, or did I get all the way through it? And I wasn't anything horrible about the show. I just couldn't get into it. I'm not a big fan of that actress. I know she was on The Walking Dead. I didn't really like her on that either. But it just didn't really hold my attention. And I didn't really watch Picard because I didn't really want to see Patrick Stewart at 85 years old or whatever it was doing that. No offense. But man, you just sort of stayed away from that series. Let's see, I didn't watch any Lower Decks, or I've been watching Strange New Worlds, and I've been enjoying that show. There's a few episodes that aren't great, but really, even the original series had episodes that weren't great. But for the most part, I like the cast. I like Anson Mount as Captain Pike. I think he does a good job. The different version of a captain, but I like him, and I like the stories they're doing. Some of them are familiar, very familiar. They're not really pushing the envelope with that series, but I've been enjoying it, and I can't wait for the third season to see what they do with it. But ultimately, I just haven't really been enthralled with new Star Trek. But I grew up at a time where we learned this wonderful thing that maybe a lot of YouTubers could take note of. Of course, they wouldn't get all the subscriptions and the money they get for having videos like that. But I grew up at a time where if you didn't like something, you just didn't watch it. You didn't have to run around telling everybody how horrible it was. You just kind of went, I don't really like this. What else is on? So that's sort of my feeling with the very new Star Trek. Although Strange New Worlds, I have been enjoying that. So that brings us to the end of our Star Trek journey through these 6 films. And I know you're sad. I know you're sad. I'm sad. I'm going to miss talking about the films. I'm going to miss talking to you about these films. However, you can continue to listen to my amazing reviews twice a week. Once on the weekend, usually Sunday evening, I do a new theater release movie, and I'll give you a review for that. And then about midweek, towards the end of the week, I give you a streaming surprise review for some movie I found on, I don't know, whatever, Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, it doesn't matter. I'll find something and give you a review on that. So you can continue this journey into the Starfleet of podcasting with me, the Captain Kirk of podcasters. I can live with that. Listen to my show and enjoy all of my amazing reviews. Spock, how would you rate my reviews? Fascinating. I've gone off the deep end. But yes, please come back for those episodes and listen to my reviews. Follow the show. I gave you all the ways to do that. Follow me on social media. Give me your comments. Let me know what you thought about this series and how I did. If I ever do another film series like this, I am going to have to change a few things because this was a lot. 3 episodes in 1 week is a lot to do. So I might change it to once a month or something like that. But we'll see. Right now, I'm going to take a little bit of a break from it because I need to concentrate on marketing this show. I've kind of let that slide to the back burner, and I need to get that so we can conquer the podcasting universe. At any rate, I just want to tell you I appreciate you listening to my show and listening to this series of reviews. I tell everyone I know I've got the smartest and sexiest audience in all the podcast universe. And as you are traveling around on this blue and green ball bouncing through the cosmos, remember Tabak, Tabe, and to live long and prosper.